I'm not the type to air my dirty laundry, but after what happened, I needed an outlet. Maybe sharing this will help someone else see the red flags I missed, or ignored. My name's Jake, and I've been married to Emily for 6 years. 6 long, happy, I thought, years. We met in college, bonded over our shared love of hiking, and built a life that I thought was solid. But everything unraveled at her company Christmas party. Emily worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm. She always made these parties sound boring, typical corporate schmoozing, too much alcohol, and awkward small talk. Every year, she'd insist it wasn't worth my time, so I didn't push. This year, though, I decided to go. Call it a gut feeling or maybe a subconscious desire to reconnect, but something felt off. Lately, Emily had been distant. She'd stay late at work more often, glued to her phone, and her once bubbly personality had dulled around me. I told myself it was just stress, but deep down, I knew better. The party was at some swanky downtown venue, a far cry from the boring events Emily always described. The room buzzed with energy, laughter, and a little too much champagne. Emily introduced me to a few colleagues, her smile tight and her hand barely grazing mine. I noticed a guy, Brian, or maybe Brandon, honestly, I didn't care, who seemed a little too comfortable with her, and the way she laughed at his jokes made my stomach twist. It wasn't until later that night that things really started to go downhill. Around 10 p.m., Emily excused herself, saying she had to check on a project deadline with some coworkers. I waited. And waited. An hour passed. 2. I felt like an idiot standing there alone, nursing a drink, while Emily was nowhere to be found. A colleague of hers, a woman named Lisa, noticed me and struck up a conversation. Lisa was tipsy, chatty, and a little too honest. She let it slip that Emily had a reputation for being the life of the party at these events, something I'd never seen at home. She's so wild when she lets loose, Lisa said, laughing. I can't believe she even brought you this time. The word stung, but I played it cool, asking where Emily was. Lisa gave me a look I couldn't quite place, pity. Guilt? Oh, she's probably with the crew in the penthouse, she said, waving it off. Penthouse? No one mentioned a penthouse. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to walk, not run, to the elevator. I didn't want to overreact, but something in my gut screamed that I wasn't imagining things. By the time I reached the top floor, my hands were shaking. What I walked into still haunts me. The penthouse was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows, a fully stocked bar, and a massive hot tub bubbling away on the balcony. But I wasn't there to admire the view. My eyes scanned the room, and that's when I saw her. Emily. My wife. Sitting in the hot tub with 2 men. She wasn't just sitting there, she was leaning against one of them, his arm draped casually around her shoulders, while the other poured champagne into her glass. They were laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Like I didn't exist. For a moment, I froze. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind raced, trying to come up with some kind of explanation that made sense. Was this a misunderstanding? A harmless joke? But the way she looked at them, the way they looked at her, made it painfully clear this wasn't innocent. I must have made some kind of noise, because her head snapped in my direction. Her eyes widened in shock, and her smile vanished. Jake, she stammered, scrambling to sit up straighter, as if that would somehow make this look less damning. The 2 guys just smirked, clearly unbothered by my presence. What the hell is this, Emily? My voice was low, but the anger and hurt were barely contained. I felt like I was standing outside my own body, watching the scene unfold. It's not what it looks like, she said quickly, climbing out of the hot tub and wrapping herself in a towel. Her hair was wet, her face flushed, and I couldn't tell if it was from embarrassment or something else. We were just hanging out. It's harmless. Harmless. I repeated, my voice rising. You're in a hot tub, half naked, with two guys, and I'm supposed to believe this is harmless? Do you think I'm stupid? Jake, please, lower your voice, she hissed, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. As if I was the one causing a scene. By this point, the two men, Ben and Dave, I later learned, were looking at me like I was some kind of pathetic joke. One of them raised his glass in a mock toast, while the other leaned back in the tub, completely unfazed. Relax, man, Ben said. We're all just having fun. Something in me snapped. Fun? I said, turning to Emily. Is this what all those late nights at work were about? Is this why you didn't want me to come tonight? Her face crumpled, but she still wouldn't admit it. You're blowing this out of proportion, she said, her voice trembling. We're just friends. That's all this is. Friends don't act like this, Emily, I shot back. Friends don't lie to their spouses, disappear for hours, or let this happen. How long has this been going on? She didn't answer. She couldn't even look me in the eye. I turned on my heel and walked out of the penthouse, leaving her standing there, dripping wet and calling after me. I didn't want to hear her excuses, her lies, or her attempts to spin this into something it wasn't. My world had just shattered, and I wasn't sticking around to watch her pretend like it was still intact. The elevator ride down was a blur. My mind was racing, and my chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. How had I been so blind? The signs were there, the late nights, the secrecy, the sudden lack of intimacy, but I ignored them, convinced that Emily was just stressed or tired. Now, I couldn't unsee what I just witnessed. When I reached the lobby, Lisa was still there, laughing with a group of coworkers. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Jake, are you okay? She asked, but her tone wasn't genuine. It was the kind of concern people show when they're just curious about the drama. I didn't answer. I just walked out into the cold night, my thoughts spinning, my hands shaking. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I loved, had just ripped my heart out in front of a room full of people. And the worst part? I had a sinking feeling this was only the tip of the iceberg. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't. The idea of walking through the door and seeing Emily after what I'd just witnessed made me sick to my stomach. Instead, I drove around aimlessly, replaying the scene in my head over and over. Her laughter, the way she leaned into that guy, the smirk on their faces when they saw me, like I was the intruder in my own life. Eventually, I pulled into a 24-hour diner and sat in the corner with a cup of coffee that I barely touched. My phone buzzed repeatedly with calls and texts from Emily, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I stared at the screen, her name flashing again and again, until the buzzing finally stopped. A text popped up instead, please, Jake, just come home. Let's talk. Talk. What was there to talk about? I needed answers, yes, but I wasn't ready to hear her excuses, her justifications. Still, as I sat there in the stale glow of the diner lights, I started connecting the dots, the little things that I'd dismissed or explained away. The late nights at work that had suddenly become a regular thing. The way she'd started guarding her phone, always flipping it over when she set it down. The random girls' nights that never added up, where she'd come home hours later than expected, smelling like a mix of perfume and alcohol. I'd questioned her once or twice, but she always had an answer, a big project, an overzealous coworker buying everyone drinks, a dead phone battery. And like an idiot, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. But now? Now it was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a one-off bad decision or a drunken mistake. The way she carried herself in that hot tub, with confidence, like she'd done it 100 times before, told me this had been going on for a while. My stomach churned as I thought about all the times she'd kissed me goodbye or told me she loved me while carrying on like this behind my back. Around 3 a.m., I finally drove home. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, but her car was there, so I knew she was waiting. I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the front door, trying to summon the strength to face her. When I finally walked in, she was sitting on the couch, her face pale and blotchy from crying. She stood up as soon as she saw me, her eyes wide with panic. "Jake," she said, her voice soft and trembling. "Thank God. I've been so worried about you." I didn't respond. I just stood there, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the woman I'd seen upstairs in that penthouse. "How long?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Her face crumpled. "Jake, it's not what you think." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice suddenly sharp. "Don't lie to me. How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, her hands twisting together nervously. That hesitation was all the answer I needed, but when she finally spoke, her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "A little over a year," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "A year. 12 months. 52 weeks. That entire time, I'd been living a lie, completely oblivious to the betrayal happening right under my nose. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "Why?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" Tears streamed down her face, and for a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "It just happened. I didn't mean for it to get this far." "You didn't mean for it to get this far?" I repeated, my anger bubbling over. "Emily, this wasn't a one-time mistake. You've been lying to me for over a year. You've been screwing around with not one, but 2 guys. How do you even justify that?" She didn't have an answer. She just stood there, sobbing, while I felt my heart harden in a way I didn't think was possible. I realized then that the woman I thought I knew, the woman I thought I loved, wasn't real. Or maybe she was, but she wasn't mine anymore. She hadn't been for a long time. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did she. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the silence between us deafening. And as the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds, I made a decision that would change everything. By the time the sun came up, I felt numb. Sitting there on that couch, staring at Emily like she was a stranger, it was hard to believe this was my life. It was surreal, like watching someone else's nightmare unfold. But it wasn't someone else's nightmare. It was mine. Emily had tried talking to me a few times throughout the night, but I wasn't in the mood for her excuses or half-hearted apologies. I couldn't even look at her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her in that hot tub, laughing and comfortable with those men like she didn't have a care in the world. Like I didn't exist. Around 7 a.m., I finally broke the silence. My voice was flat, emotionless, like I was running on autopilot. "I'm done, Emily." She flinched like I'd slapped her. "What do you mean, done?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Jake, we can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just please, don't give up on us." "Us?" I repeated bitterly, finally looking at her. "There hasn't been an us for over a year, apparently. You gave up on this marriage the moment you decided to crawl into bed with them." Her face crumpled again, and the tears started flowing. "It wasn't like that," she insisted. "It wasn't about love or replacing you. It was just a mistake. A stupid, selfish mistake." "A mistake is something you do once," I shot back. This was a choice. Over and over again. You chose to lie to me. You chose to betray me. And you chose them over me, Emily. So don't sit there and pretend like this was some fleeting lapse in judgment." She didn't have an answer. She just sobbed, her shoulders shaking, while I sat there, stone-faced. Maybe a part of me wanted to feel something, anger, sadness, anything, but I couldn't. I'd already felt it all, and now there was nothing left but cold, hard resolve. "I'm filing for divorce," I said finally, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence. "This marriage is over." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "No, Jake, please," she begged, scrambling toward me. She reached out to grab my hands, but I pulled away like her touch burned. "We can fix this. I'll cut them off completely. I'll do anything you want, just don't leave me." I stood up, towering over her as she knelt on the floor, pleading with me. "You should have thought about that before," I said, my voice cold. "Before you destroyed everything we built. Before you made me look like a fool." She was sobbing uncontrollably now, but I didn't care. I'd heard enough. I walked out of the living room, grabbed my keys, and left the house without looking back. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to get as far away from her as possible. I drove to a nearby park and sat on a bench, staring at nothing in particular. The weight of everything finally started to hit me, and I felt tears sting my eyes. But I didn't cry. Not then. I was too angry, too hurt to let myself break down. Instead, I focused on what needed to happen next. I knew I had to protect myself. Emily had lied to me for over a year, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into staying. I needed to take control of the situation, to make sure she couldn't twist the story or turn this into some kind of pity party for herself. So I pulled out my phone and started making a plan. I found a divorce lawyer online with good reviews and left a message, asking for an urgent consultation. I also called my bank and started the process of separating our finances. It was all so clinical, so detached, but it was the only way I could keep myself together. By the time I got back home, Emily was still sitting on the couch, her face red and blotchy from crying. She looked up at me with hopeful eyes, like she thought I'd changed my mind, but I didn't say a word to her. I walked straight to the bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag, and started packing some clothes. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To a hotel," I said simply. "I can't stay here." She started crying again, but I ignored her. I zipped up the bag, slung it over my shoulder, and left. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, relief, but one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let her destroy me any more than she already had. The hotel room was small and unremarkable, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating weight of the house I'd just left. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the plain beige walls, and tried to process everything that had happened. Part of me was still in shock, replaying the events of the last 24 hours like a bad movie I couldn't turn off. After a few minutes of sitting there in silence, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the lawyer I'd contacted earlier. To my surprise, they called me back almost immediately and scheduled a consultation for the next morning. Just hearing that I had an appointment made me feel like I was finally taking control of my life again, even if it was just a small step. Once that was set, I started scrolling through old texts, emails, and photos, looking for anything that might serve as evidence of Emily's infidelity. If I was going to divorce her, I wanted to make sure there was no room for her to twist the narrative. I didn't know if I'd need it, but gathering proof felt like the only way I could protect myself. It felt cold and calculating, but that's the person I had to be now, someone who put my own well-being above anything else. The more I searched, the more pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Text messages from numbers I didn't recognize, marked with vague excuses like, "It's just a coworker." Calendar events that didn't line up with her stories. Late-night work emergencies that seemed suspiciously frequent. All these little details that I'd brushed off in the past now felt glaringly obvious. I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. At one point, I found a thread of texts between Emily and someone labeled as Ben W. The messages were casual on the surface, work-related jokes, memes, and random banter, but the tone shifted after a few scrolls. "Last night was amazing," one message read, and my stomach churned. Another one, sent just weeks ago, can't wait for the next party, you always know how to make it interesting, winky face. I felt sick. My hands trembled as I read through each exchange, trying to comprehend how the woman I'd loved for so long could be this person. And then I saw his name pop up again in a group thread, this time with another name I recognized, Dale. It wasn't just one guy. It was both of them. They were in on this together, like it was some kind of twisted joke at my expense. By the time I was done, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut all over again. But instead of wallowing in it, I saved screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself for safekeeping. I wasn't about to let Emily gaslight me into thinking this wasn't what it clearly was. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her in that hot tub, laughing with those men like she didn't have a care in the world. My anger felt like a physical weight in my chest, pressing down on me until I thought I might explode. But mixed in with the anger was a deep, aching sadness. This wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the death of the life I thought we'd built together. The next morning, I arrived at the lawyer's office feeling raw but determined. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Karen, listened patiently as I explained everything. She didn't flinch when I told her about the hot tub or the texts. Instead, she nodded, took notes, and walked me through the steps I needed to take. First, we'll file for divorce on the grounds of infidelity, she said firmly. You'll want to separate your finances immediately if you haven't already. And if you can, start documenting everything, texts, emails, bank statements, anything that shows what she's been doing. The more evidence we have, the stronger your case will be. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief for the first time in days. Karen's confidence was reassuring, and knowing that someone was on my side gave me the strength I needed to keep moving forward. When I left her office, I called the bank and had our joint accounts frozen. It felt strange, almost ruthless, but I knew I had to protect myself. Emily had already betrayed me in the worst way possible, I wasn't going to give her the chance to take advantage of me financially, too. Later that day, I checked back into the hotel and started making a list of everything I needed to do next, gather more evidence, find a new place to live, and figure out how to tell my friends and family what was happening. It felt overwhelming, but for the first time since all this started, I felt like I was finally taking control of my life again. That night, as I lay in the uncomfortable hotel bed, I thought about the future. I didn't know what it would look like, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let Emily's betrayal define me. This was the start of a new chapter, and I was determined to come out stronger on the other side. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of messages and missed calls from Emily. It seemed like she'd decided to switch tactics from denial to desperation. The messages ranged from frantic apologies to pleas for me to come home and work things out. One voicemail in particular stood out, her voice was trembling, almost frantic. "Jake, please, I know I messed up, but you can't just throw everything away like this. We've been together for so long. I made a mistake, but it doesn't have to end like this. Please, just, call me back. Let me explain." Explain? What else was there to explain? I'd seen enough, heard enough, and read enough. But part of me knew this was only the beginning of her attempts to salvage what was left of her carefully crafted image. I didn't respond. I didn't have it in me to engage with her lies or her crocodile tears. Later that afternoon, she took it a step further and showed up at the hotel. I wasn't surprised, Emily had always been persistent when she wanted something. I heard the knock on my door and, without even checking, knew it was her. I considered not answering, but I knew she wouldn't leave until I did. So, with a deep breath, I opened the door. There she stood, her face pale, her eyes puffy from crying. She looked like a shell of the confident, put-together woman I'd married. For a split second, I felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly drowned out by the memory of her laughing in that hot tub. "Jake," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Can we please talk? I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. What is there to talk about, Emily? You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. She flinched at the coldness in my tone but pushed forward. I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. But can't we just try to fix this? We've been through so much together. Don't let this be the end. I shook my head, feeling the anger bubbling up again. Fix this? How, exactly? By pretending it didn't happen. By ignoring the fact that you've been lying to me for over a year while sleeping with not one, but two guys. You didn't just screw up, Emily. You destroyed everything we had. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped closer, reaching out to grab my hand. I pulled away, and the hurt in her eyes was almost enough to make me waver. Almost. Jake, please, she whispered. I love you. I'll do anything to make this right. I'll cut them off. I'll go to therapy. We can go to therapy together. Whatever it takes. Her words felt hollow, like she was grasping at straws. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this in the first place, I said quietly. You don't betray someone you love, Emily. You don't humiliate them, lie to them, and treat them like a fool. Love doesn't do that. She started sobbing, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching her break down. I knew she was trying to manipulate me, trying to play on my emotions, but I wasn't going to let her guilt me into staying. This wasn't just about what she'd done, it was about the person she'd shown herself to be. Someone I didn't recognize anymore. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said firmly. I've frozen the accounts, and I'm moving forward with the divorce. You can either make this easy or drag it out, but I'm done, Emily. There's no going back. Her face crumpled, and she dropped to her knees right there in the hotel hallway, clutching at my pant leg like a lifeline. Jake, please, she begged. Don't throw us away. Don't throw me away. I stepped back, her hands falling to the floor. You threw us away the moment you let them into your life, I said, my voice cold. This is on you, not me. I closed the door before she could say anything else. Her muffled sobs echoed down the hallway, but I didn't open the door again. I sat on the bed, staring at the wall, and tried to process what had just happened. Emily had always been good at getting her way, but this time, her tears and pleas couldn't undo the damage she'd caused. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing up for myself, choosing my dignity over the illusion of a happy marriage. It hurt like hell, but deep down, I knew it was the right thing to do. The messages kept coming that night, but I didn't respond to any of them. I knew that if I gave her even the smallest bit of hope, she'd try to worm her way back into my life. And I wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. The anger and pain came in waves, sometimes hitting me so hard I felt like I couldn't breathe. Other times, I felt nothing at all, just a hollow numbness that made it hard to focus on anything. I was on autopilot, going through the motions of preparing for the divorce and figuring out how to rebuild my life. Emily, meanwhile, wasn't giving up. Every day brought new texts, emails, and voicemails. Some were tearful apologies, begging me to come home. Others were angry outbursts, accusing me of being heartless for throwing everything away. It was exhausting, but I ignored them all. I had nothing left to say to her. One night, as I sat in my hotel room scrolling mindlessly through my phone, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Hello. Jake, it's Linda. Her voice was hesitant, like she wasn't sure if I'd hang up on her. Linda was Emily's coworker, the one who'd unknowingly let slip about Emily's wild reputation at the party. I hadn't spoken to her since that night, but hearing her name immediately brought back the anger and humiliation I'd felt. What do you want, Linda? I asked, my tone flat. I wanted to apologize, she said quickly. I had no idea things were that bad between you two. If I'd known, I never would have said anything. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to yell at her, to tell her that she'd been complicit in covering up Emily's lies. But the other part of me realized that she wasn't the one I should be angry with. She hadn't forced Emily to cheat. That was all on Emily. Why are you really calling? I asked finally. She sighed. Look, I know I shouldn't get involved, but I feel like you deserve to know the truth. Emily, she's been lying to everyone, not just you. She's been telling people that you're the one who walked out for no reason, that you've been neglecting her, and that's why she turned to Ben and Dale. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. As if the betrayal itself wasn't bad enough, now she was trying to rewrite the narrative to paint herself as the victim. Of course she is, I muttered, rubbing my temples. She's always been good at playing the victim. I'm sorry, Linda said again. I just thought you should know. And for what it's worth, a lot of us at work don't believe her. We've seen how she acts. We've seen the way Ben and Dale are around her. You didn't deserve this, Jake. Her words were small comfort, but they did reinforce what I already knew. I had to get as far away from Emily and her toxicity as possible. Thanks for telling me, I said, even though the gratitude felt hollow. I appreciate it. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The fact that Emily was trying to spin the story didn't surprise me, but it still hurt. It was just another layer of betrayal, another reminder of how far she'd fallen from the person I thought I married. The next day, I met with my lawyer again to finalize the divorce paperwork. I told her about the conversation with Linda, and she nodded knowingly. It's not uncommon, Karen said. When people like Emily get caught, they often try to shift the blame to avoid taking responsibility. But don't worry, we'll make sure the truth comes out. Hearing that gave me some relief, but it didn't erase the ache in my chest. The reality of betrayal wasn't just about what Emily had done, it was about everything it had destroyed. The trust, the love, the memories we'd built together, they all felt tainted now, like they belonged to someone else's life. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I tried to focus on the future. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I had to move forward. I couldn't let Emily's actions define me. I couldn't let her win. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained but determined. The lawyer's words stuck with me, don't worry, we'll make sure the truth comes out. I wasn't going to let Emily's version of events go unchallenged. This was my life, my dignity, and I wasn't going to let her tarnish it any more than she already had. First on my list was gathering everything I needed for the divorce. Karen had advised me to document everything, text messages, emails, financial records, even photos if I had them. I spent hours combing through old files, screenshots, and receipts, compiling a case that would make it impossible for Emily to deny what she'd done. As I worked, I found little things that brought a lump to my throat. Photos of us from happier times, vacations, anniversaries, silly selfies we'd taken at home. Looking at them felt like staring at strangers. The smiles in those photos felt like lies now, tainted by the knowledge of what she'd been doing behind my back. I tried to shove those feelings aside and focus on the task at hand, but it wasn't easy. Later that afternoon, I went back to the house to grab the rest of my belongings. I texted Emily beforehand, letting her know I'd be stopping by and asking her not to be there. Thankfully, she agreed, though her response was dripping with passive aggressiveness. Take whatever you want, Jake. I'm sure it's all my fault anyway. When I arrived, the house felt different, cold and empty, like all the warmth had been sucked out of it. As I packed up my things, I noticed small changes. Her wedding ring was gone from the dresser. The framed photo of us on our wedding day was missing from the living room. It was like she'd started erasing me from her life, just as I was erasing her from mine. I made quick work of gathering my things, clothes, personal documents, and a few sentimental items I couldn't bear to leave behind. As I packed, I noticed a stack of unopened bills on the counter. Curious, I flipped through them and found several overdue notices for credit cards I didn't recognize. It looked like Emily had been racking up debt, probably trying to keep up the appearance of the life she wanted everyone to believe she had. That discovery only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just leaving a bad marriage, I was escaping a toxic, self-destructive situation that could have dragged me down with it. As I loaded the last of my belongings into the car, I took one last look at the house. It didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't for a long time, if I was being honest with myself. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I was closing a chapter of my life, and while it hurt like hell, I knew it was the right thing to do. That evening, Emily called me again. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Maybe I wanted closure, or maybe I just wanted to hear what excuse she'd come up with this time. "Jake," she began, her voice soft and hesitant. "I saw you came by today. I wanted to know how you're doing." "How I'm doing?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "You really want to know how I'm doing, Emily? After everything you've done?" She sighed, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But I still care about you, Jake. I still love you." I laughed bitterly. "You have a funny way of showing it." There was a long pause before she spoke again. I don't want things to end like this. I don't want you to hate me." "I don't hate you, Emily," I said, surprising even myself. "I'm disappointed. I'm hurt. But hate? No. That would take too much energy, and you're not worth it anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I could hear her soft intake of breath, like she hadn't expected me to say that. Maybe she thought I'd still cling to some hope of reconciliation, but I was done. There was no going back. "Goodbye, Emily," I said, ending the call before she could respond. As I sat there in the quiet of my hotel room, I felt an odd sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from everything being okay, it was the peace that came from knowing I was finally taking control of my life again. Emily's betrayal had shattered me, but piece by piece, I was starting to rebuild. The following week, things escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. While I had been focused on separating my life from Emily's and preparing for the legal side of the divorce, Emily decided to drop another bombshell. It started with a text, "We need to talk. It's important." I ignored it. After everything, I didn't trust her motives. But she followed up with a voicemail later that evening. Her tone was serious, even panicked, and I could hear her voice trembling as she said, "Jake, please call me back. There's something you need to know, and it can't wait." Against my better judgment, I called her. I told myself it was to avoid any potential legal surprises, but deep down, I was bracing for whatever new chaos she was about to throw at me. When she answered, her voice was shaky, like she'd been crying. "Jake," she started, "there's something I've been keeping from you, and you deserve to know the truth." I clenched the phone tighter, the anger rising in my chest. "If this is some last-ditch effort to justify what you did, I'm not interested, Emily." "It's not about that," she said quickly. "It's about me. About us." She hesitated, then finally blurted it out, "I'm pregnant." The world seemed to stop for a moment. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what she'd just said. Pregnant? My mind raced, replaying the last few months. We hadn't been intimate in a long time, longer than I cared to admit, so there was no way the baby could be mine. "Is it mine?" I asked coldly, though I already knew the answer. There was a long pause, and then she whispered, "I don't know." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "You don't know? Jesus, Emily. Are you even hearing yourself right now? You've been sleeping with 2 other guys, and now you're pregnant, and you don't even know who the father is? Do you have any idea how messed up this is? I know, she cried, her voice breaking. I know how bad this looks, okay? But I'm scared, Jake. I don't know what to do. That's not my problem anymore, I snapped. You made your choices, Emily. You lied to me, you betrayed me, and now you want me to feel sorry for you. I'm done. Whatever mess you've gotten yourself into, you can figure it out on your own. She was sobbing now, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too hurt to feel anything resembling sympathy. This was just another layer of betrayal, another reminder of how far she'd fallen, and how much damage she'd caused along the way. Before she could say anything else, I ended the call. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Pregnant. The idea of her carrying another man's child, after everything she'd already put me through, was almost too much to bear. I spent the rest of the night in a haze, trying to make sense of it all. Part of me wondered if she was even telling the truth, if this was just another manipulation tactic to try and pull me back in. But even if it was true, it didn't change anything. The marriage was over. My feelings for her were gone. And whatever happened next was her burden to bear, not mine. The next day, I called my lawyer to update her on the situation. Karen listened patiently as I explained everything, then reassured me that the pregnancy wouldn't affect the divorce proceedings. If the child isn't yours, it's not your responsibility, she said firmly. And if she tries to claim otherwise, we'll handle it. Her confidence was comforting, but the situation still weighed heavily on me. Emily's betrayal had already shattered my trust, and now she'd added another layer of chaos to an already messy situation. I knew I had to stay focused on the end goal, getting out of this marriage and starting over, but the road ahead felt more complicated than ever. As I sat in my hotel room that night, I made a promise to myself: no matter what happened with Emily or her pregnancy, I wouldn't let her drag me down any further. I'd come too far to let her pull me back into the mess she'd created. This was her problem now, not mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could finally start to move on. About a week after Emily's bombshell confession, I was doing my best to stick to the plan, focus on the divorce, separate my life from hers, and keep moving forward. The calls and texts from her had slowed down, which was a relief, but I knew it wasn't over. Emily was the kind of person who thrived on control, and losing me meant losing the grip she'd always had on our relationship. I was expecting more drama at some point, I just didn't know when it would come. One night, as I sat in my hotel room working on some emails for work, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was spam, but then it rang again. Something about it felt different, so I reluctantly answered. "Jake," a woman's voice said, tentative and unfamiliar. "This is Jake," I replied warily. "Who's this?" "This is Dr. Reynolds from the emergency department at St. Mary's Hospital," she said, her tone professional but gentle. My stomach dropped immediately. Hospitals and emergency rooms rarely brought good news. "Your wife, Emily, has been admitted, and she asked us to contact you." I froze. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. "Is she okay?" I asked, my voice tight. "She's stable now, but there were complications with her pregnancy," the doctor explained. "She's asking to see you. I understand you may not want to come, but I thought you should be informed." I let out a long breath, my emotions swirling. A part of me wanted to ignore the call, to leave her to deal with the consequences of her own choices. But another part of me, maybe out of habit, maybe out of some lingering sense of responsibility, felt obligated to at least check on her. Despite everything, she was still the woman I'd spent 6 years of my life with. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll come." The drive to the hospital was tense. My mind raced with a mix of anger, worry, and frustration. Why was I doing this? Why did I feel like I owed her anything after what she'd done? But no matter how much I tried to push the feelings away, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. When I arrived, a nurse led me to her room. Emily was lying in the hospital bed, pale and exhausted. Her face lit up slightly when she saw me, but I didn't return the warmth. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, keeping my distance. "Jake," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming." I didn't respond right away. I just stared at her, trying to decide how I felt about seeing her like this. Vulnerable. Fragile. It was such a stark contrast to the confident, manipulative woman who had turned my life upside down. "What happened?" I asked finally, my tone cold and distant. She looked down at her hands, which were fidgeting with the hospital blanket. "There was a complication," she said softly. "I started bleeding, and I was terrified I was going to lose the baby." I raised an eyebrow, my patience already wearing thin. "And why exactly did you ask them to call me? I'm not the father, remember?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she was going to break down completely. "I didn't know who else to call," she said, her voice trembling. "Jake, I know I've hurt you. I know I've ruined everything. But when I thought something might happen to the baby, I just wanted you here." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Do you hear yourself, Emily? You're sitting here asking me to comfort you when you don't even know if the baby is mine. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds?" Her tears spilled over, and she looked away, her shoulders shaking. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of guilt, but I quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't my responsibility. This wasn't my problem. "I'm glad you're okay," I said finally, my tone softer but still firm. "But whatever you're dealing with now, it's on you. You made your choices, Emily. Don't expect me to be the person you turn to when things fall apart." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her behind. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I truly understood that this chapter of my life was over. Emily might still try to pull me back in, but I wasn't going to let her. I was done. Walking out of that hospital was like closing the door on a chapter of my life that had been dragging me down for far too long. Emily's tears, her apologies, her drama, it no longer had power over me. I was done playing the role of the supportive husband, the person she could fall back on when her lies and betrayal caught up to her. The next morning, I met with Karen, my lawyer, and gave her an update about Emily's pregnancy and the hospital incident. "She doesn't know who the father is," I explained, my tone bitter. "But I don't want there to be any confusion. I'm not responsible for that child." Karen nodded, already scribbling notes. "We'll make sure that's clear. Once the baby is born, we can request a paternity test if she tries to claim you're the father. But for now, we stay the course. Divorce first, then we handle anything else that comes up." Her calm, confident demeanor was exactly what I needed. I handed over the additional evidence I'd gathered, screenshots of text messages, financial records, even photos I'd found on her social media that tied her to Ben and Dale during times she claimed to be working late. The more I dug into her life, the more blatant her lies became. It was infuriating, but at the same time, it felt good to know I was taking control. "You've built a strong case," Karen said after reviewing the documents. "Infidelity is hard to deny when there's this much evidence. She might try to fight the divorce, but with what you've provided, you'll have the upper hand." The word "fight" stuck with me. Emily wasn't the type to back down easily, even when she was clearly in the wrong. She thrived on control, and losing me meant losing her ability to manipulate the narrative. I knew she wasn't going to make this easy, but I was ready for whatever she threw at me. In the days that followed, I took every precaution Karen suggested. I opened a new bank account, rerouted my paycheck, and froze the joint credit cards. I wasn't going to let Emily dig herself deeper into financial trouble with my name attached. I also started looking for a new place to live, a fresh start away from the house that now felt like a monument to everything that had gone wrong. Meanwhile, Emily continued her attempts to reach out. Her messages became less frantic and more calculated, as if she'd realized that desperation wasn't working. One text stood out in particular: "Jake, I know I've hurt you, but we can still fix this. Think about all the good times we had, all the years we spent building a life together. Don't let one mistake destroy everything." One mistake. The audacity of her words made me laugh out loud. This wasn't one mistake, it was a series of deliberate choices, each one more damaging than the last. Her text wasn't about fixing things, it was about salvaging her own ego and trying to maintain control over the situation. I didn't respond. I didn't see the point. My silence was my answer, and the more I ignored her, the more she seemed to unravel. A few days later, she sent another message, this one dripping with venom: "You're being cruel, Jake. I made a mistake, but you're the one destroying this marriage by refusing to forgive me. You're acting like a child." I wanted to reply, to remind her that she was the one who destroyed the marriage, but I didn't take the bait. Karen had warned me that anything I said could be used against me, and I wasn't about to give Emily any ammunition. My focus was on the bigger picture, getting the divorce finalized and cutting her out of my life for good. As the days turned into weeks, I felt myself growing stronger. The anger and hurt were still there, but they weren't as overwhelming as they had been in the beginning. I started to see glimpses of a future without Emily, a future where I didn't have to constantly question her loyalty or wonder what lies she was telling me. It was a future I could rebuild on my own terms, free from the weight of her betrayal. The process wasn't easy. There were moments when the sadness crept back in, when I found myself mourning the life I thought I had. But each time, I reminded myself of the truth: the life I was mourning wasn't real. It was an illusion, a lie that Emily had built to keep me in the dark. And now that I could see clearly, I knew I deserved better. By the end of the month, Karen had filed the divorce papers, and Emily had been served. The ball was officially rolling, and there was no turning back. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. The divorce papers were filed, and I expected things to move forward smoothly, at least legally. But Emily, true to form, didn't make it easy. She contested the divorce, claiming she needed more time to process, and even suggested marriage counseling as a condition before signing anything. I wasn't surprised. This was classic Emily, grasping at control and dragging things out. But Karen was prepared. "This is a delay tactic," she assured me. "We'll push back hard." Emily also started spreading rumors, framing herself as the victim. Friends reached out, confused by her version of events. I explained the truth calmly and sent screenshots to anyone who doubted me. Slowly, her narrative began to unravel. Despite her attempts, I stayed firm. "Counseling won't fix this," I told her in one of our rare conversations. "You destroyed the marriage, and I won't pretend otherwise." My words seemed to hit her, but whether it was guilt or just frustration, I couldn't tell. Either way, I kept my distance and let my lawyer handle the rest. The cracks in her facade were showing, and for the first time, it felt like I was truly free from her manipulation. A month later, Emily gave birth earlier than expected, and, as anticipated, the question of paternity resurfaced. I hadn't spoken to her directly since our last heated conversation, but my lawyer informed me that Emily's attorney was requesting involvement from me, likely a last-ditch effort to entangle me in her mess. Karen insisted we demand a paternity test immediately. "If it's not your child, this will shut down any claims she might try to make," she said. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing it was the only way to close that chapter for good. The test results came back 2 weeks later. The child wasn't mine. The relief was overwhelming. I didn't realize just how much I'd been holding my breath until that moment. Whatever lingering doubts Emily had tried to plant in me were gone. When Karen informed Emily's lawyer, I expected some backlash, but there was none. Emily didn't contact me, no messages, no voicemails, just silence. Maybe the reality of her choices had finally hit her, or maybe she'd moved on to her next game. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully, knowing I was truly free of her and everything she tried to drag me into. After the paternity results came back, a strange calm settled over my life. Emily's silence was deafening, and for a while, I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me thought she was plotting something, another manipulation, another attempt to worm her way back into my life. But days turned into weeks, and I didn't hear a word from her. Karen confirmed that Emily hadn't filed any additional motions or made further demands. She may be realizing there's nothing left to fight for, she said. The divorce was proceeding smoothly now, with no further resistance from her side. The finish line was in sight. Still, I couldn't shake the lingering curiosity about her silence. This was Emily, after all, the same woman who had tried every tactic imaginable to keep control. And yet, now, it was as if she disappeared from my life entirely. No texts, no calls, no dramatic gestures. It was almost unsettling. Then, one day, I ran into Linda, the coworker who had unintentionally tipped me off about Emily's behavior at the party. I was grabbing coffee when she approached me, hesitant but clearly wanting to talk. "Jake, hey," she said, offering a nervous smile. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but, "How are you holding up?" "I'm doing fine," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "The divorce is almost finalized. Just tying up loose ends." She nodded, then hesitated before saying, "I thought you might want to know. Emily quit her job. A couple of weeks ago, actually." That caught me off guard. "She quit?" Linda nodded again. "Yeah. Things got awkward after everything came out. People found out about her and Ben and Dale, and, well, you can imagine how the office reacted. Ben left town, and Dale was fired for some unrelated reason, but Emily couldn't really save face after that. She's been laying low ever since." Hearing that brought a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, knowing that her actions had real consequences. But another part of me, one I didn't want to admit existed, felt a twinge of pity. Emily had burned so many bridges, and now it seemed she had nothing left. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, unsure of what else to say. Linda gave me an encouraging nod before walking off, leaving me with my thoughts. That night, I found myself reflecting on everything. Emily had built her life on lies and deceit, and now it seemed like the house of cards had finally collapsed. While I didn't wish her harm, I couldn't deny that her downfall felt like justice. She had hurt me deeply, but she had also hurt herself in ways I doubted she even fully understood. For the first time, I felt a sense of closure. Emily's silence wasn't a ploy, it was the result of her having no moves left to play. She'd lost her job, her reputation, and her marriage, all because of her choices. And while I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, I felt no guilt in walking away from the wreckage she'd created. I spent the rest of the evening packing up the last few things from my hotel. I'd finally found a new apartment, a place that felt like a fresh start. As I folded clothes and sorted through boxes, I realized how far I'd come since that night at the party. The pain was still there, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. It was just a scar, a reminder of what I'd endured and survived. Emily had faded into the background of my life, and I was finally ready to let her stay there. This was my time to move forward, to rebuild, and to focus on the things that mattered, my own happiness, my own peace. As I stood in my empty hotel room, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't the same person I'd been when this all started. I was stronger now, wiser. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. The day the divorce was finalized felt surreal. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no shouting or finger-pointing, just a quiet acknowledgement that it was over. Karen called to let me know the paperwork was signed, sealed, and official. Emily hadn't contested anything further, and for that, I was grateful. Walking out of the courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant or even sad. I felt relieved. The weight of the last year had finally been lifted, and for the first time in months, I wasn't looking back. Emily's chapter in my life was closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. The first thing I did was move into my new apartment, a modest but comfortable place that I could truly call my own. I took my time setting it up, choosing furniture and decor that reflected who I was now, not who I'd been during my marriage. Every piece I added, every box I unpacked, felt like a step toward reclaiming myself. Over time, I started reconnecting with friends I'd drifted away from during my marriage. Emily had always been the social one, and I'd fallen into the habit of letting her take the lead when it came to our social lives. Now, I was making my own connections, rebuilding relationships, and discovering just how much support I had around me. It was humbling and heartwarming to realize how many people genuinely cared. Eventually, I dipped my toes back into dating, not because I was looking for anything serious, but because I wanted to remind myself that there was life beyond Emily. At first, it was awkward. The scars from her betrayal hadn't fully healed, and I carried a lot of trust issues with me. But slowly, I began to let my guard down. I met people who were kind, understanding, and patient, and while I wasn't ready for anything serious, I appreciated the moments of connection. What surprised me most, though, was how much I enjoyed being on my own. I started hiking again, rediscovering the passion that Emily and I had once shared but that I'd let slip away during our relationship. I spent weekends exploring trails, breathing in fresh air, and letting nature remind me of how big and beautiful the world could be. It became my therapy, my way of grounding myself in the present and leaving the past behind. Looking back, I realized how much I'd learned from the entire experience. Emily's betrayal had shattered me, but it had also forced me to rebuild myself in a way I never would have otherwise. I learned the importance of boundaries, of self-respect, and of listening to my gut when something felt off. Most importantly, I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. If I could give advice to anyone in a similar situation, it would be this: don't stay where you aren't valued. Don't let someone else's lies make you question your own worth. And when it all feels impossible, remember that healing is a process, not a straight line, but a journey full of ups and downs. Eventually, you'll come out the other side stronger and wiser. As for Emily, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to another city, trying to start over. I didn't feel the need to keep tabs on her. Whatever life she was building now was no longer my concern. I wished her no harm, but I also felt no lingering attachment. She was just someone I used to know. One evening, as I stood on a cliff overlooking the sunset after a long hike, I thought about everything I'd been through. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was all still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I had survived it. I had grown from it. And now, standing there with the wind on my face and the world stretched out before me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.